Well, welcome everyone to this Open Group webinar, which today is being brought to us by our friends at Avolution Software. Before I hand over to our speakers today, Ed and Tim, I'd just like to go over some housekeeping to keep the event moving forward smoothly. Firstly, with regards to questions, if you'd like to ask Ed and Tim a question, then the best way to do that is to write your question in the QA text facility. If you do write a question in there, can I ask you to address it to all or all participants? That way everyone gets to see all the questions that are being submitted. And we will try and answer as many questions as we can at the end of today's presentation. Now, today's event is being fully recorded, so if for any reason you have to leave early, or if you experience any local technical difficulties, and I know that sometimes the audio can be problematical, then everyone who has registered for today's event will get an email with an appropriate URL where they can access that recording. So Tim, if you're ready, can I ask you to start today's event?
Yeah, thank you, Simon, and good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to people in the US. So thanks very much for joining us today. The astute of you may notice very subtly there's a little plus at the end of the title there. So we're talking today about road mapping with TOGAF and ArchiMate Plus. Now, what that is alluding to is actually a few things. First and foremost, it's actually, well, I guess not a TOGAF and ArchiMate training course, if anyone was expecting that. We're looking at trying to provide some guidance that's beyond what you get out of the box with TOGAF and ArchiMate. So we're looking to try and give some sort of direction and some insight into some of the experience we have from applying these two frameworks for many years now. The other aspect to it is that it's beyond work that we've presented before. So Ed and I have done a number of presentations for the Open Group before. So if any of you have seen us talking about road mapping, there's going to be some new stuff we're going to be talking about as well today. So keep an eye out for that. But yeah, otherwise let's get into it. Now I'm seeing on the chat that some people are saying the audio might be difficult. I don't think that's my end. So Simon, maybe do you want to just confirm the audio's okay for you guys?
The audio's fine, Tim.
Yeah, okay, sorry. So apologies to whomever that is. I guess it's a bit of weird stuff as you can't hear me say that you should be able to hear me. But anyway, right, so quick run through bullet points on the agenda today. I'm going to sort of cover off obviously just the start here. So looking at obviously the context around why road mapping, and I will pass on to Ed for the kind of the meat in the middle, and then we'll both be able to take questions at the end. So really we're going to sort of look through on sort of some of the definitions behind what are roadmaps, what guidance does ArchiMate and TOGAF give around road mapping. We'll demonstrate the value of them. We'll show you some real world situations where we found them useful, but of course then how do you, I guess from the rubber meets the road, how does this become practical? So each of you, dare I say on Monday, but it's already Wednesday, so maybe even by Friday, you might be able to start to do some things that are very valuable for your organization already. Okay. So quick background on myself. So I'm Tim O'Neill. Simon's already introduced me. I've been with the company since it started. I've been in this industry now for over 20 years, working with some of the sort of major transformation programs around the globe. I've sort of specialised in some of the sort of top end, the pointy end of the tree with some major sort of projects. I work for a company called Avolution, which most of you know. We're a major player in this space. We have a tool called ABACUS, which over several thousands of companies use and tens of thousands of people use. Otherwise, Ed, I guess I presume you want to say hi, introduce yourself too?
Yes, just quickly. So my name is Ed Granger. I'm a discipline specialist. I'm a consultant with Avolution. I'm also an EA. I'm an enterprise architect. About 10 years in EA, primarily in financial services. But certainly, having worked with Avolution now, it's broadened my horizons considerably. So you'll see from the graphic some of the kind of industry sectors we face off into. And certainly we try and bring all that kind of expertise and all that learning back into our core product and service offerings.
Cool, thanks Ed. Okay, so yeah, so let me give you some sort of context into, I guess, what is road mapping and why is it needed, and indeed how is it sort of positioned in things like TOGAF. So As this slide says, if you do a word cloud, and certainly we know from all the sort of inquiries we get from clients and prospects and things like that, road mappings are very, very much, I'd almost hazard a guess to say, the #1 thing people ask for. So it's obviously clearly something that falls on the remit of the enterprise architect. We as practitioners are one of the few people who have that entire view of what an enterprise does and indeed what it should be doing going forward. And it's one of the things we're asked to produce is that, that kind of future-looking vision of where a company is trying to go, and indeed what's important is the steps along the way to get there. So a roadmap's not just the destination, of course, it's the path or the variable paths that you might take to get there. It's very much driven by change. Historical evolution of companies often being, segmented where they're, grown through acquisition, and so you've got these kind of stovepipes of different departments or different operating companies who've done things in different ways, and you're looking to try to move those forward into some sort of cohesive whole. There's then always some dare I say, some contrary things there. People are often very tactical, very myopic about the way that businesses have grown over time, and so you've given lots of waivers, you've issued lots of exceptions, so that you've got a lot of technical debt and a lot of enterprise debt that's been incurred, and people are finally biting the bullet and trying to do some more strategic things. So often that's a driver for doing a roadmap. And ultimately, there's external forces that come in terms of things going end of life. So good old Windows XP is not supported anymore, but also the regulatory things. We've all lived through the Y2Ks and now GDPR. These things are coming and they will continue to come. There's various financial regulatory things around BAL that are coming through as well. So there's always these external forces that drive these things. But ultimately, as enterprise architects, we're here to manage risk. I mean, our job is to try to present a path or some sort of risk mitigation strategy that we think a business should be following. Okay. And really this just elaborates on that. It looks at, for want of a better word, a lot of use cases around road mapping. So we talk about them as different missions. There's sort of different things we're trying to solve. So, whether it is just purely a, rationalization, a cost reduction kind of push, whether it's some sort of, customer response, with, business moments and things like that driving, the change that we're looking for. As we just mentioned on the last slide, a compliance thing. Or some sort of historical fragmentation that we might have, or segmentation that we might have through acquisitions and mergers, or ultimately it might be to try to exploit some innovations that are coming. And there's all the different things around AI and machine learning that everyone's certainly researching and prototyping and piloting. So it's onboarding some of those technologies and moving in those directions that can be drivers to these roadmaps. So not surprisingly, many different motivations for them. And unfortunately or fortunately, there's no one answer. So fundamentally, as an architect, we now need to be pretty flexible about how we approach this. So that's certainly what we're going to go through now, and I'll pass over to Ed now to sort of look at how we... Actually, no, sorry, I have one more slide. I'll give the TOGAF definition just quickly, sorry, then I'll pass to Ed. So, right, so TOGAF does have a lot to say about road mapping, and indeed gives a definition. So you can all, I guess, read the words that are there, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with section 3 of the standard, all the definitions there. I won't do this to death, but basically there's not really any agreed understanding of what a roadmap is while it's defined, and you'd all know that TOGAF has many definitions for things. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's agreed by everybody, but the one thing, or dare I say the two things that are agreed with everybody about what a roadmap is, it's something to do with change. So it's obviously looking at things that are going to be different, and it's change over time. Now, whether the time frame is days, weeks, months, invariably it's longer scale than that. So it's in the years time frame. So it's basically looking at change over time. Now, there's a lot of debate within the open group and even in other forums about the differences between roadmaps and life cycles and plans and all these sort of things. So we'll try to tease through that a little bit. But ultimately, the thing to just remember a roadmap is really just trying to describe change over time. So that doesn't immediately mean a Gantt chart, right? Everyone instantly starts to think, okay, that must mean a Gantt chart. No, no, no. There's many different ways you can talk about change over time, and of course, many different ways you can codify and explain that to your business stakeholders of how things are going to change over time without just bashing out a Gantt chart. So don't get me wrong, a Gantt chart is absolutely a type of roadmap, but there's many other types. So yeah, with that, I guess I'll pass to Ed to start to walk you through how we've sort of seen that through TOGAF and ArchiMate as a practice. Thanks, Ed.
Great, thank you, Tim. So just to kind of keep you on tenterhooks for another moment before we kind of dive into the actual method and road mapping, one of the first things you guys are going to have to think of as architecture practices is actually having the foundations for road mapping in place. So obviously we would say this, we're a tool vendor, we have a commercial offering in this space. I'm not going to do a hard sell on you, I'm just going to give you some of the considerations you should be thinking about when you're setting up your road mapping initiative. So the first one, obviously this is an open group webinar, and the first one is whether or not to use a standard. Well, I guess the answer to that one is kind of implied by the fact we're here at all. But it's worth just thinking about what it is that standards like TOGAF and ArchiMate actually do give you from a road mapping point of view. Because they give you a lot, to start with, they give you, pre-configured assets like reference models, like, the TOGAF TRM, for example. They also give you a methodology, so they give you actually a way to shape up your roadmaps. And the obvious one here is the architecture development method, the ADM and TOGAF. They also, one very close to our heart from an EA tooling point of view, they give you metamodels. So we're going to need to be road mapping different elements of our architecture, be they business elements or applications or technologies. We also need to understand the relationships between those things in order to roadmap. And the metamodel fundamentally will give you those different parts and the relationships between those parts. So if you haven't looked at the TOGAF 9.2 metamodel, spend some time just going through it and understanding how it breaks the architecture down into a set of connected elements. And of course, it will also give you templates in the case of docs or notations if you're diagramming for actually representing the roadmaps. And certainly the emphasis of this session is more on the visual representation of roadmaps. So we're not necessarily going through document templates. We are going to be talking about how you visually show those roadmaps to your stakeholders. And particularly, ArchiMate has some offerings around there. So ABACUS, which is Avolution's product, obviously we're certified for TOGAF 9.1. We're certified for ArchiMate 3. We do support TOGAF 9.2. We're not certified for it yet. I don't think anybody is. So certainly that will be on the cards. But really, I think just building on Tim's point from the earlier point about the plus in the title of the presentation, our consistent experience of working with clients who are using either TOGAF or ArchiMate or both is that they use them as a toolbox. They use them as a great grab bag of methods and approaches, but they're not afraid to tailor them, not afraid to extend and build on top of them. And that is very much going to be the theme of this presentation. So here's just a quick view of our TOGAF 9.2 library. The eagle-eyed amongst you will see that we've updated the meta model for the latest changes. But fundamentally, in terms of the architecture development method, the two phases we're most concerned with when we're talking roadmaps are phases E and F, opportunities and solutions, and migration planning. And for those of you who worked through those phases before will know that you incrementally you build up the collection of assets you need to actually articulate that transformation journey. Similarly, in ArchiMate 3 and the ArchiMate 3 standard, ArchiMate obviously has its core business application and technology layers, which are fundamentally used to represent the different layers of the architecture, their different components and relationships, but also has a number of kind of extensions, and one of which is the implementation of migration area. The various elements that make up that part of the ArchiMate standard are concerned with the kind of road mapping concepts similar to the things that are going to drive you from one state of the architecture to another, and of course actually representing those states themselves, so representing the different points in time, the different kind of slices through the architecture timeline that you need to articulate that journey. So both TOGAF and ArchiMate provide a rich palette of methods and approaches for articulating roadmaps. So when you're, quite apart from the standards, there are a number of things that your architecture repository needs to do in order to roadmap. And again, TOGAF is extremely useful in this space because, it has this concept of an architecture repository and the various parts that make that up. And really, if you're in the market for an EA tool or in the market for some kind of road mapping platform, this is a very good thing to wave under people's noses and say, to what extent do you support all these different parts? So for example, we have the architecture metamodel. Now, obviously, a reference to the fact it needs to support TOGAF and or ArchiMate. One of the key considerations you'll find is that if you need to reach out into your wider organization, for example, to your business analysts or to your solution designers, you're going to start going into areas where they're speaking a different language. So they might be talking BPMN for processes or UML for application modeling. So one of the key things around the meta model is it has to be adaptable enough not only to build a core around those architecture concepts, but also to allow you to subsume other material into it, which may be expressed using different standards. So it's unfortunately the reality that we're typically not dealing with one standard whenever we're doing a road mapping exercise. The next really important part is the reference library. Now, this is where we can bring in, reference models, pre-existing reference models, which you absolutely should do to avoid reinventing the wheel. In kind of TOGAF enterprise continuum terms, we have the very generic stuff like the TOGAF TRM, right up to the kind of industry-specific stuff, and we see a lot of usage of things like BIAN for banking industry, capability models, the various APQC domain-specific models, TM Forum for telecoms. So absolutely use these existing reference models to accelerate your road mapping effort. Obviously, we also have the standards information base, and this is where we essentially want to bring in things like lists of standard technologies into that area. And a very useful resource here, for example, is Technopedia, which is a big library of technologies which you can draw out of to populate your standards information base. But also, obviously, we have things like lists of cloud services, like from AWS or Azure. We can equally consume those type of lists into our repository. And finally, we have the various representations of the architecture landscapes themselves. So, we talk about things like catalogs or inventories, matrices, diagrams are absolutely bread and butter of the kind of, modeling the architecture, representing the architecture. But additionally, we have things like charts, reports and dashboards, and 3D and data visualizations. So it's not the case, really, that there's any one way or any standardized way to look at your architecture and your roadmaps. We can really make use of all these different views to paint a rich picture. Why not build it in MS Office? Well, having at least once in my career, and it wasn't my fault, I hasten to add, been involved in an Excel-based road mapping disaster where the data got completely corrupted. I'd say you need to think seriously about that. So fundamentally, if you're taking a data-driven approach to road mapping, that data needs to be managed, and it needs to be managed in a platform which is fit for purpose. But more than that, if we're taking a data-driven approach, then it opens the doors for things like automation, to the ability to query that data, and the ability to integrate data from multiple sources. So we really need something that is a data platform to do that. And that is, something which is not to be taken lightly. You need to consider the kind of information capabilities that you're going to require to actually do your road mapping. Which basically means, again, going back to the point about reaching out into the wider organization to draw in your existing data. When you roadmap, if you're road mapping a portfolio of applications or processes or whatever, you will need a lot of data. So you need to have an ability to manage that data, and you also need the ability to integrate with those external sources. Bring in that existing knowledge that sits in project docs with databases like CMDBs and actually integrate it into your road mapping view, but also potentially push stuff back out again. So you need to think about efficient integration between your road mapping platform and the external ecosystem. Right, that's enough of the sales talk. Let's talk about building some roadmaps. So let's just, as Tim said, this is not a training course. So the guys are expecting us to literally work through the standard and cover off all the assets. I'm afraid we're going to play it a bit faster and looser than that today. But we are going to reference fundamentally, what roadmaps mean in TOGAF and ArchiMate terms, and then how you can build on them. So in TOGAF, fundamentally, when we talk about a roadmap, we're not necessarily talking about one thing. We're really talking about a package, a collection of things. And as you go through those phases of the ADM, you're going to create a number of different artifacts, a number of different views, each of which serves a specific purpose, and of course you can pick and choose between those. But typically you might come up with a portfolio of work packages. So fundamentally these are the bits of activity that you need to do to transform your architecture from one state to another. You will pick up a list of gaps, solutions, and dependencies, and you may define one or more transition architectures. So fundamentally you're not necessarily going to get from your baseline to your target in a single step. There may be incremental steps along the way, and we'll talk a bit more about those. Now we pulled out, some of the guidance as well. So some of the rich guidance that TOGAF provides around these steps. So there may be things like, this business value assessment matrix, which basically we're taking those bits of planned activity, those work packages, and actually rating them for things like risk and value, and then looking at whether those initiatives are on target or at risk or in trouble or whatever. So really, there's some optional things. There's some things that TOGAF provides as best practice that you may fold into those roadmaps. There's some other core assets like the implementation factor assessment, implementation recommendations. At a kind of detailed level, when you're actually looking at things like individual applications, we may be putting date properties on them to actually start to drive some kind of time-based view. But fundamentally what we're driving towards is that implementation and migration plan. So that set of recommendations, initiatives, architectures, which is going to tell the organization how to transform from one state to another. Now the reason I'm not going into detail on these is because fundamentally we're talking about visual roadmaps in this session. So what we don't necessarily have here is a single picture, which is this is the roadmap. Now this is where ArchiMate does potentially provide us with a solution. So ArchiMate obviously is a diagramming standard, and as well as the ability to actually model the core business and application and business layers, we do also have, as I referenced earlier, in that implementation and migration part of the standard, we do have some specific concepts around which are relevant to roadmaps. For example, we have 3 applications, the blue boxes in the middle of the picture, which might equally be part of other viewpoints. But here we've got a specific implementation and migration viewpoint. At the bottom, the red boxes, so we have the red rectangles are basically work packages, defined bits of activity, work that we need to actually drive to the architecture from one state to another. And the dots above them are the deliverables, the things that those work packages are actually producing. And at the top, we have the kind of time-based concept. So the green blocks are what we call plateaus. And a plateau is basically a stable state of the architecture. You can think of it as a release. You can think of it like a baseline or a transition or a target architecture. Any point at which you basically want to sort of draw a line and say, this is a point in time or a point in the evolution of the architecture that we actually want to measure or model, represent. So plateaus, you can see, are actually connected to those applications depending on when they're implementing. So we actually get a time-based view of those applications. And between those plateaus, the kind of page-type icons, the page-type shapes, I beg your pardon, are gaps. So these are basically showing the gaps. If you've been through the TOGAF, if you've consolidated your gaps in the ADM phases, then you'll actually, this is one way of visually modeling them. You can actually show those gaps visually and can show basically which plateaus are addressing which gaps. So ArchiMate gives you quite a rich visual language for basically breaking down the various elements of the roadmap. And so it has those core concepts of the things you're road mapping, the activities which are pushing the architecture from one state to another, and the actual states themselves. And those are the real key concepts around road mapping. However, as Tim alluded to, that's not the only way to do it. And for those of you who've seen one of our previous road mapping webinars, you'll know we have many, many styles of roadmaps. And I think it's relevant to bring these in because we see that our stakeholders using TOGAF and using ArchiMate are not only providing those, producing those core viewpoints actually defined in those standards, but they're also producing many, many other viewpoints on top of them. And really this is a key message, is that, fundamentally, if you're building a roadmap, you are typically facing out to an audience who are not necessarily going to be conversant with architecture. They don't necessarily know TOGAF, they don't necessarily know ArchiMate, they might not even know what architecture is. But typically the guys you're trying to persuade to fund transformation are, they want to understand the journey in a very intuitive way. And it's very difficult necessarily to say what that style that they're going to respond to is, which is why we really have a whole range, a whole palette of different ways that we can present the same data out. But the important thing always in producing a roadmap is not just to be technically accurate, but to take your stakeholders on a journey and make sure they understand not just where we're going, but why we're going there. So I think before we do that, we're just going to break down what we see, and this is very much an evolution view, but what we see as the fundamental elements of any roadmap. So roadmap, as I say, is a journey, and of course, like any journey, you have to have a start point. You have to start somewhere. You have to have a clear statement of where you are today. So the first thing to do is to establish that start point, in TOGAF terms, the baseline. Then obviously we need to say where we're going. We need to say this is our aiming point. In TOGAF terms, the target. We actually have to say we're trying to get from A to B. But most critically, and this is something that architects often are not very good at, we also have to be able to articulate why we're going there. What's the reason why this is the right destination rather than any of the other places we could go? We have to actually be able to articulate the business benefits or the technical benefits of the transformation. And finally, we need a way of getting from A to B. So we actually need a means which is going to transport us from one state to another. It's very easy to draw future state architectures, target state architectures, unless there's actually some money behind them, unless there's some resource behind them, unless there's some change funding behind them, then they risk becoming just ivory towers of, conceptual things which will sit on the shelf and never go anywhere. So when we talk about road mapping styles, and this includes the road maps we just looked at, the TOGAF and ArchiMate views, we tend to drop stuff into 4 categories. And these 4 categories I'm just going to quickly scoot through. But the idea really is, going back to my previous theme, there is no one way to roadmap. There is no single style you should be considering. You basically have to see what lands with your stakeholders and adapt to that. One of the nice things about these 4 different styles is that actually, there are some styles which are very well configured to when you're just starting out. There are some styles which are very advanced. But as you build up your data, as you build up your road mapping capability, you'll be able to do more and more of these, and you'll be able to present out your data in many different ways, depending on the stakeholders, depending on their level of detail they need, and their personal visual preferences. So the first style we look at is simply tagging with recommendations. So basically, this is a very easy thing to do. Many people don't even consider it to be a roadmap. But basically, we will take a collection of elements. They could be applications, they could be technologies, and we will simply give them a tag. We'll say whether or not they're strategic, whether or not we want to take them forward into the future, if we want to decommission them. This doesn't just have to be technology things. If you look at the latest TOGAF guidance around business capabilities, you'll see that it's one of the recommended approaches to actually tag your business capabilities by whether or not that's a capability you currently fulfill, whether it's something that's aspirational, whether it's something that you could do better. So really, whichever level of the architecture, whichever part of the architecture you're looking at, you can use this approach. And one of the great virtues is it is very simple. It provides immediate clarity about where the effort should be going, where the strategic emphasis is, where the resources should be aligned. And once you have that information, you can present it in many different ways. But the kind of key question around this one is, okay, well, how do I then arrive at a view of what's strategic and what isn't? How do I arrive at a view of what needs to go into my target architecture and what doesn't? Well, hopefully, if you've been through the ADM, you've already done that analysis. But fundamentally, we can reduce that to a specific tag, and many of the popular approaches out there include things like time, so tolerate, invest, migrate, eliminate. Typically, a tag will put against applications saying whether we want to invest in them or decommission them. The 4 Rs is another one: retain, redesign, refresh, retire. There are multiple different ways of categorizing either your applications or your processes or technologies out there. But basically, these values will then drive the representation of those things in the roadmap. Now, you can arrive at them by a very subjective process. You can get a bunch of SMEs, a bunch of good guys together in the room and just get them to vote yes, no, maybe for each of the elements. Or you can take a more data-driven approach. So for example, in the application portfolio management space, we use algorithms to calculate business and technical fit from a number of input properties, and then that drives their strategic recommendation. But the common element really is here, we're using color. We're just using very simple color, typically red, amber, green, to tell a story around the elements we're road mapping. We're also, something we do quite a lot is we use data visualizations. So these are very useful, partly because they're interactive, but partly because they're a very good way of actually presenting a very large volume of information. And you can see, for example, where we've got a screenshot of our various application portfolios, each of them under a different organization unit. You can also get a kind of very quick view of the level of strategicness or the level of goodness of each of these portfolios without necessarily having to drill down into the detail. So the very simplest road mapping style is simply to do, as I say, that type of tagging. Now, that's very good from a communication point of view. It gives you a clarity over where the investment should be going and where the effort should be going. One thing it doesn't tell you is when stuff is going to happen. So, in work package terms, we're not actually saying when we're going to execute these things, or we're not looking at dependencies, or all those good things you're meant to do when forming up a view of your work packages. So Tim alluded to, the typical way of doing this in kind of project management world is a good old MS project Gantt chart. I'm sure we've all sweated over, or at least, had them, thrust on us at various points in our careers. Unfortunately, those don't actually show the architecture at all. They show activities, they show things you're doing, but they don't actually show the elements which you're road mapping. So really we need to bridge the two, and this is where we need to bring in the concept of life cycles. Now, lifecycle management is a whole domain in itself, but it definitely has relevance to roadmaps. And of course, we find these properties, for example, in the TOGAF metamodel for various different of the elements in there. Now, at the risk of getting too zen, every element in your architecture has a life cycle. Everything potentially has a life cycle. And there are kind of two fundamental types of life cycle. There are the things that you have direct control of as an organization. So, for example, launching a new business product or decommissioning an application. And there are the things that you have no control of whatsoever. So as Tim alluded to earlier, things like technology end of support dates or regulatory deadlines. I'm sure GDPR is still burning fresh in people's memories right now. So these are things that you simply have to react to. Now, a minimum life cycle is basically just two dates, the date at which something starts and the date at which something stops. And that is enough to give you some basic timescales and dependencies to start to make time-based judgments around your roadmaps. But you may want to provide richer context-sensitive guidance. So, for example, in the graphic at the bottom, we have application C has a fairly rich life cycle, which represents each phase of the application from evaluation to deployment, run, grow, maintain, migration, archive, decommissioning, its full end-to-end life. And what we can see there is that we can actually apply, for example, different investment strategies or different, strategic approaches to the application over the course of its life cycle. So TOGAF, as ever, has some useful starters for 10. So, for example, against applications, we have things like initial live date, date of last release, date of next release, retirement date. We often see our clients augmenting those with additional lifecycle phases to do things like, distinguish between business decommissioning and technical decommissioning, for example. But once you have those life cycles, obviously you can then start to model dependencies. So you can see, for example, for a given area of the business, let's say you're looking at an application portfolio, you can see when the applications that support that area of the business are going to be deployed or replaced. And it also makes it easier to identify the timing mismatches. So, for example, where an application that's going to be commissioned or deployed is going to be replaced by another application, but that application isn't actually going to be on stream for another 6 months after the decommissioning of the first application. So it kind of enables you to make those sort of time-based views and analysis of dependencies, which are then going to go back into your definition of the work package dependencies. So ABACUS, we provide some reporting, for example, that we show you where those timing mismatches happen and help you then iterate around and refine those lifecycle views. Another thing we can do is we can actually look at the life cycles, across the different layers of the architecture all at once. So, for example, and this is what we call a multi-dimensional roadmap. We will basically take an application, in this case our CRM application. We'll look at its life cycles, in isolation, but also look at the life cycles of the platforms, the technologies it's sitting on, for example, the infrastructure it's sitting on, and also, if we do have any work packages or projects aligned to it, we can look at when those projects are executing. So really working with life cycles is very powerful and will help answer many of the kind of time-based questions you have to answer when you're putting together that implementation and migration plan. Obviously, though, we need to talk about work packages. We alluded to them earlier. just knowing when stuff happening is great, but we haven't actually answered how it's happening. So we need to think about work packages, and TOGAF, as ever, has a good definition around work packages, which is a set of actions identified to achieve one or more objectives of business. A work package can be part of a project, a complete project, or a program. So there's really nothing that says, a work package has to be granular or a work package has to be coarse. It is simply a set of actions, a set of activities which are going to drive the architecture from one state to another. So we saw earlier the ArchiMate implementation and migration view, and you can see how the work packages are defined on there. And you can see, for example, how those 3 work packages at the bottom are driving basically the migration from one architecture plateau to another. So from our baseline to our transition to our target architectures. So again, ArchiMate is an extremely good standard for basically articulating visually these work packages and basically what they're impacting or what they're changing, and also how they're driving us from one architecture state to another. Equally, we can represent these things as catalogs or inventories. And again, when we talked about lifecycle management in the previous section, it's not just the lifecycle of the applications or the processes we need to worry about. It's actually the timing of the work packages themselves. We actually have to understand how the interdependencies between those bits of activity, and not just in terms of resources, but also in terms of the parts of the architecture they're transforming. So that is playing more into the kind of the Microsoft project world. The 4th type, I'm just going to gloss over very quickly, but it's not something we see people doing a lot. It is very advanced, but this is effectively where we have multiple architectures. Now, of course, the concept of multiple architectures is absolutely in the heart of TOGAF. So we have our baseline architectures, we have our target architectures, we have any number of transition architectures. So fundamentally, that is the concept of having multiple architectures. But that's not the only way we can use these architectures. So, for example, we can actually use the architectures not just to model the progression over time from one state to another. We can also use those architectures to model different scenarios. And this is why it's quite advanced, because if you guys are currently sweating over defining your target, imagine defining several targets, each of which is optimized for a different set of business objectives. But that is what you can do. And fundamentally, you can actually use these multiple architecture concepts, for example, either to, you might have multiple target architectures which are optimized for different kind of business metrics. So you have an architecture which is optimized for scalability, a different architecture which is optimized for service or availability, and then a kind of architecture which is optimized to try and strike a balance between them. So that's the graphic at the top on the right-hand side. So that's effectively where you have, a baseline architecture and then multiple targets. Or you can have a baseline architecture and a single target architecture, but multiple transition architectures, alternative transitions, effectively, which represent different execution paths between your baseline and your target. And again, these might be optimized for realizing different benefits at different points in time. So the graphic on the right at the bottom is basically showing a balance between value for money, and this being a healthcare example, a slightly nebulous concept of health outcomes, but it's basically, saying, do you want to, the path you follow from your baseline to your target, do you want to take one which is going to realize financial benefits sooner, or one which is going to, realize, for example, customer benefits sooner? As I say, this is quite advanced stuff. It takes a lot of data, but absolutely it's a style we support, and it's a style that some of us use. So let's talk about demonstrating value. Again, I'm going to kind of mash up between some of our own best practice and some of the guidance from TOGAF. But just to talk about, fundamentally, if you remember that graphic we started with the orange arrow and the 3 guys standing on it, one of the things I alluded to is architects are often quite bad at articulating the why. Why are we going in this particular direction? So often, we've all been there. We've seen the big spaghetti diagram. We all know that our applications or technologies or processes are too complicated and too expensive. We draw a nice clean diagram representing the future state, and we map a roadmap to it. But we haven't actually answered the exam question, because if the exam question is cost, then can we demonstrate that our clean architecture is actually going to cost less? Unless we complete that square, then we can't really demonstrate how our roadmap actually aligns to business objectives. So don't assume just because it's obvious to you as an architect that this is better, don't assume that it's going to be obvious to your stakeholders at all. So the graphic at the bottom basically represents, the baseline, the target, obviously the roadmap bridging the two, but the fact that we fundamentally have to measure both the baseline and the target for some business meaningful measures. And those business meaningful measures, of course, should align to your organizational objectives. So there may be costs, there may be agility, whatever. You absolutely need to be able to demonstrate the value of what you're planning. So one thing we found extremely useful, and I'm very glad to see that in TOGAF 9.2 they've actually done some more work around, is the idea of capabilities, business capabilities. So there was guidance already in 9.1. There's been some more guidance in 9.2, which I recommend you take a look at. But fundamentally, the architecture market has moved very much towards taking a capability-based view of the architecture over the last few years, and it's a very powerful thing. So I mean, capabilities in terms of what a capability is, fundamentally, it's just the business's ability to do something. Whatever that thing may be, it'll be dependent on your business model, but it might be the ability to take customer payments or the ability to launch new products. But fundamentally, it's a top-down view. And so when we're talking capabilities, we're taking a top-down view of business outcomes. Now, we're also taking a corporate view. So we might, Tim alluded to earlier, in fact, we might have many different organizational silos. Well, we might be spanning all those silos and taking a capability-based view and actually looking at, for example, the end-to-end customer capability or the end-to-end financial capability. So we're taking a corporate view of the business. Now, one of the very useful bits of guidance, around capabilities from TOGAF is the concept of capability increments, or the concept of realizing incremental benefits as we go through our road mapping journey. So this very much aligns to the kind of idea of transition architectures. It also aligns, obviously, to the ethos of things like agile, which is don't do a big bang delivery after a year. Do little drops of incremental value as you go through the process. So there's certainly some guidance on how you can plan those capability increments. You'll see, for example, there's a little chart at the bottom left here, which is the capability increment radar, which basically shows for each increment that on one or more dimensions we're improving the value, we're creating more value, we're fulfilling objectives, as we make drops of function, as we realize those transition architectures. So capabilities really are a fantastic lens for articulating the value of your architecture. But we still have to answer the exam question, what exactly should we measure by these capabilities? Now, what we found, you can almost divide it up into functional, non-functional, and financial measures. Maybe that's not the right way to define it, but certainly, there's the question of whether you can execute a capability at all. Does your organization actually have the ability to, for example, have a single view of customer? So, there might be a binary thing, yes, I have that capability, or no, I don't have that capability. But equally often, the kind of stories we want to tell about capabilities are financial stories. So how much does it cost to run this thing? How much does it cost to actually run our customer billing capability? Or, how scalable is it? Can our processes deal with extra volumes of business? Can our systems deal with it? How often does it break? How reliable is it? How agile is it? What's our time to market for each of these things? How risky is it in terms of things like cybersecurity, but also in terms of regulatory compliance? And good old complexity, how much spaghetti do I have actually underneath each of these capabilities? So we can apply all these measures and basically look at them through that capability lens. And there was a couple of examples on the right-hand side. For example, there's a bubble chart showing some of those capabilities. By, on the one hand, the financial measure, the TCO, the total cost of ownership per capability, based on the cost of underlying IT and processes, but also showing the IT complexity per capability. So it's a very good way of actually baselining your performance over the lifetime of your roadmap to actually show an improvement in these type of metrics. And of course, the lifecycle properties, when things come on stream, when they go out of service, are actually going to dictate when these measures change. So you can see at the bottom that we have, for example, a cost projection for a very small application portfolio. And we can see over the course of the roadmap, the 5-year roadmap, what the projected costs for each of those applications are. Therefore, we can say what the cost of a portfolio is. and therefore we can actually say what the cost of the capabilities that those applications support should be. So in this way, you can absolutely consider that chart can also be a roadmap and is entirely consistent with the assets you're producing through other means. The final thing I want to talk about is just basically how you actually manage delivering the roadmaps. So something that, hopefully some of this will get you thinking. You probably have your own ideas, I'm sure you do, but hopefully you'll be enthused and you'll actually want to go out and start road mapping if you're not already. But, I think we all know as architects that nasty, sickening feeling when your aspiration hits reality and you realize just how big this thing is. How many applications you have, how many processes you have, how much infrastructure you have. And that's a kind of sobering thought because, the whole point of architecture is it's about dealing with things at scale and dealing with very complex things. But of course, that means that you somehow, in road mapping, have to manage all that information and all those interdependencies. And that can be quite intimidating. So, thankfully, again, TOGAF has some very, very useful guidance around here. In specifically what they refer to as architecture partitioning. So basically, just like the old gag, which is probably very un-PC now, but how do you eat an elephant, one bite at a time or one chunk at a time, the architecture partitions basically show you how to break the architecture down into manageable chunks. And we need to do this for a number of reasons, not just because of the sheer scale of it, but also because individual organization unit architectures, they may actually conflict with each other. So we may actually have to have, different approaches across different org units, for example. Quite apart from anything else, it's likely to be that you're going to have multiple people working on your roadmaps at the same time. So it might be that you have, guys working on business process roadmaps or application roadmaps, each of whom faces off to a different org unit or business unit. But similarly, if you think back to that multidimensional roadmap, we're going to have potentially application guys, business guys, infrastructure guys, technology guys, all working on different parts of that architecture concurrently. And we somehow need to manage those interdependencies. Finally, obviously, the demands of architecture reuse means that we need some kind of modularity. We need to be able to actually provide some modular architecture segments that can then be incorporated into broader solutions. So we might be road mapping common bits of technology, common capabilities, whatever. So just a single slide. There are many, many more pictures like this in the standard, but a single slide basically showing the principles of architecture partitioning. So fundamentally, what TOGAF is saying is we can break the architecture into a number of kind of different levels, which we can broadly consider to be strategic, segment level, and then individual capability architectures. And really what this is doing is just applying some dimensions to that set of architectures, to that set of roadmaps we need to produce, and breaking them down by these dimensions. So firstly, we're looking at the breadth, the scope, or the coverage of roadmaps. So are you looking at all your business processes? Are you simply looking at the business process for one business unit? Are you looking at the business process for a single team? What is the scope of the actual of this part of the architecture that you're covering? The next one is, what's the level of detail you want to go down to? How detailed do you want to get? Do you want to just look at very large applications like ERPs? Do you want to look at all your applications? Do you want to look at individual modules of applications? Do you want to look at services exposed out by applications? So you can get into very granular levels of detail, and depending on who you're facing off to, you may need to. But it's always, the case that you need to keep that level of detail appropriate to your stakeholders. We need to look at time. We need to look at how long are our roadmaps? Are they 5 years? Are they 1 year? Are they 5 months? How far ahead are we looking? What's our planning horizon? And very closely related to that, we need to actually look at recency. So what's the rate of refresh of these roadmaps? So, these last two are kind of closely related. Because typically, if you're taking a 5-year view, you're unlikely to be refreshing that every week. So you might be refreshing your 5-year roadmap, once a year or once every 6 months. But on the other hand, if you're right down in the weeds, if you're actually producing something which is telling you what's going to be happening next month and the month after, then obviously you need to keep pace with the tempo of enterprise change. You need to actually be refreshing that on a pretty regular basis to make sure that your guidance is up to date. So, a good enterprise architecture tool should be able to actually represent all these different, these different partitions, both from a management point of view, so in terms of giving the architects and giving the people contributing to the road mapping exercise the ability to actually manage their information at this level. We should be able to support that, but also going back to the main theme of this presentation, it should also be able to do that from a stakeholder point of view. So you don't want to be presenting those detailed component by component roadmaps for an application to your CIO. You need to be able to tell the high-level stories to the high-level guys, the low-level stories to the low-level guys, and basically keep those things consistent. Now, keeping them consistent and then reintegrating all those different work streams is quite a trick. So it's something which is not to be taken lightly. And then going back to the point really about choosing your road mapping platform carefully, this is a very strong argument for having some kind of integrated, database or dataset based tool rather than a series of standalone assets. Because if you are basically managing these off, a series of individual PowerPoints or individual Excel sheets, frankly, your chances of getting back to a coherent story after you split the architecture up are much, much lower than the fact is if you've been working off something which is fundamentally integrated in the first place, and you're simply using views to actually, partition that up into manageable chunks. But whatever the case is, it's almost certainly the case that you're going to be, in terms of the guys doing this, they are almost certainly going to be working on different parts of the roadmap concurrently at the same point in time, so everything's going to be changing all at the same point in time. They're almost certainly going to be distributed. You might be lucky they're all sitting in one room or sitting in the corner of the room. More likely they'll be across different sites, potentially across even different countries or time zones. So in terms of partitioning, really this is an argument then basically going back to the start of the presentation to say, think carefully about what your road mapping platform is, because it is going to have to fundamentally support all these requirements. That's about as much of the content I have. So obviously we've taken a very quick skim through, or we've taken a skim through TOGAF, both in terms of the kind of ADM phases, but also mainly looking at some of the guidance and some of the best practice. And likewise ArchiMate, and as you guys will have seen, we've augmented that with quite a bit of our own best practice and our own learnings. But I think the thing I would reiterate is really these are things that our clients who are using TOGAF and ArchiMate are actively doing and finding successful. So really our aim as ever is to really share those learnings and share those experiences back with the community. So the takeaways I'm going to leave you with, just 5 points. Firstly is think about your road mapping platform. Think about fundamentally how you're going to manage the process of road mapping. And you by all means welcome to do it in Microsoft Office, but just be aware of the limitations of that. And if you're going to use it, make sure you have some way to mitigate the risks around it. Obviously, this is open group. Use the standards. Some clever guys have spent a lot of time and they've been validated in an awful lot of places. So, use those standards, understand those standards, but also, going down to number 3, be confident enough to know when to pick and choose between them. So don't just feel that you have to slavishly follow something because it's in the standard. You absolutely need to keep that appropriate to your stakeholders and appropriate to your mission. So I don't think I'm saying anything that TOGAF would contradict, for example. It's there to be picked up, it's there to be used, it's there to be tailored, and there to be adapted to your own organizational context. Absolutely use business capabilities to tell the why story around the architecture. So use them as a lens to articulate those key business measures. Because you are likely to be talking to guys who don't speak architecture, but typically they do speak capabilities. And if they're the guys with the money, then you have to be talking their language. You can't be expecting them to speak yours. And finally, you understand the concepts of partitions. Use them to divide up your road mapping effort, and use them basically to make sure you're managing the data at the appropriate level, but also presenting the data at the appropriate level. So I'm going to stop there. We have a little bit of time left for Q&A, literally I think about 5 or 6 minutes. So Simon, I don't know if we've got some questions. I've seen a few things coming in as we've gone through.
Yeah, and I've been taking them as well, Ed. So don't worry, there have been lots of questions along the way. I know that you wouldn't have been looking because it would have thrown you. So no, we've had good 20 plus questions. I've been taking them online. I'm pretty sure, Simon, you can confirm when we distribute, you distribute the recording. I'm pretty sure it does include the Q&A section, doesn't it? So obviously people can go through that as well. Yeah.
Absolutely, it does, Tim. You have the QA facility and the chat facility. There will be in the recording.
Yeah, no, that's great. So there might be a few last ones coming in now, Ed, but no, don't worry. There were some good ones there, and I'll show you what I was kind of saying when we get the recording as well. But there's a couple of last ones here. I can see one is Abacus integrated with Archie. So yes, you would know, I'm sure, that ArchiMate maintains a interchange language or a standard for interchanging between ArchiMate certified tools. So Archie exports to the ArchiMate XML, of course, and Abacus imports that, and vice versa. So certainly you can start things off with Archie and draw some, what do you want to call ArchiMate diagrams, and then pull them all into Abacus and continue on your merry way after that. That's as far as I can see, Simon, the only outstanding question there.
Yeah, I think that's it. You've done a great job there, Tim, keeping up all the questions as they came in.
Yeah, no, we're a double team. That's the way Ed and I seem to do this pretty well. I get the back office job. He gets the front office one.
Fantastic. Well, in that case, Tim and Ed, I think this is a good time to wrap up today's session.
Yep.
Do you have any further, any last words you'd like to share with the audience?
I don't think so from our end. Just a quick shout out, if you want to know more about Abacus, you want to know about how Abacus supports TOGAF and also ArchiMate, then you can get in contact with us. Some quick contact details. Feel free to either email us or take a look at our site and just see what takes your fancy.
That is great stuff. So Ed and Tim, if you send me a copy of your presentation, I'll make sure I get those shared out with the requests that I've got coming in for those copies.
Yep, no trouble.
Okay, thank you, Simon.
All right, Ed.
All right.
Thanks,
cheers, guys.
Thanks, Ed.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone, for visiting or joining us today.